All right, diving right in today. We're tackling Alzheimer's disease.
Yeah.
It's complex, it's personal, and we've got some really interesting sources to kind of unpack.
Yeah.
We've got data from the Alzheimer's Disease Data Initiative. We're going to be looking at the Alzheimer's Association's Facts and Figures report.
Mm-hmm.
And we've also got this really helpful guide for family caregivers.
Okay.
So we're really going to try and explore the facts, but also like the human side of this disease.
Right.
How it impacts people, families, I mean, really even society as a whole.
I think it's going to be a journey for us too, like
Yeah.
challenging our assumptions and hopefully leaving everybody with a deeper understanding of Alzheimer's, which I think a lot of people have, kind of a surface level understanding.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think when people think Alzheimer's, they immediately go to memory loss,
Right.
which is, it's a huge part of it. But it goes so far beyond that.
It does.
And I think a lot of people don't really realize the scope of how impactful it is.
Yeah, and how many people it actually affects. I mean, just looking at some of these numbers from the Alzheimer's Association.
Yeah, I was going to say, some of the statistics are pretty startling.
Yeah.
So I think one that really kind of puts things into perspective, at least for me, is that by 2050, the number of Americans living with Alzheimer's is projected to nearly double.
Wow.
We're talking 13 million people.
That is, wow. Yeah, that's a huge number. So I mean, that kind of begs the question of like, what's leading to this kind of dramatic increase?
Right.
Is it something we're doing? Is it just that we're living longer?
I mean, I think obviously, as we all know, age is a big risk factor for Alzheimer's.
Yeah, it's the biggest one.
And so as people are living longer, we would expect to see more cases. But
Yeah.
is that the whole story?
Or are there other things at play here? I mean, what are researchers saying about that? Yeah. Well, researchers are looking at everything right now. So they're looking into lifestyle, genetics, environment. I mean, they're trying to untangle. It's this like knotted up ball of potential causes, and it's really fascinating.
Yeah, it's like a detective story almost, right?
Yes.
You're looking for the clues to crack the code of Alzheimer's.
Exactly.
But it's incredibly high stakes because we're talking about, millions of lives,
Yeah.
a huge strain on the healthcare system,
Absolutely.
the burden on families, both emotionally and financially.
Yeah. I mean, think about the societal impact. If we have so many people, living with this debilitating disease, it's a huge wake-up call for all of us.
Yeah, for sure. So, okay, before we get too far down that road,
Yeah.
I think it's important that we sort of take a step back for a second and make sure that we're all on the same page about what exactly Alzheimer's is.
Okay.
Because I think there can be some confusion.
Right.
So, I mean, can you give us like a simple explanation?
Sure. Well, Alzheimer's is a type of dementia. It's actually the most common type.
Okay.
And it's a brain disorder that really, over time, it slowly destroys memory and thinking skills. And eventually it progresses to the point where people can't carry out even the simplest tasks.
Right. And it's like I said before, it's not just forgetting where you put your keys or,
Exactly.
little things like that. It's much bigger than that.
Yeah, and it really does. It's like chipping away at a person's identity,
Yeah.
It affects their ability to communicate, to make decisions, to recognize loved ones.
It sounds terrifying.
It is. It's a devastating journey for, not just the individual, but everyone around them.
Yeah, and I think that's one thing that really struck me reading through these sources is the impact on caregivers.
Oh, absolutely.
The millions of Americans who are caring for loved ones with Alzheimer's.
Yeah, and a lot of times it's family, friends. These people are shouldering so much,
Yeah.
both physically and emotionally.
Exhausting, yeah. And one of the things that the Caregiver Guide highlights is that almost 70% of dementia caregivers find coordinating care just incredibly stressful.
Yeah, I can see that.
And 2/3 of them really struggle to find, adequate resources and support.
And that makes sense when you think about how complex the needs are of someone with Alzheimer's.
Right.
I mean, it's a 247 job.
Yeah.
You need constant vigilance, patience, compassion. I mean,
It's a lot.
it really is.
And, I think the guide really dives into those very real challenges.
Yeah, it does.
The changes in communication, unpredictable behaviors,
Mhm.
the sensitive issue of providing personal care. I mean, it really kind of gets into the nitty-gritty.
It does. And it's a process. It doesn't just happen overnight. Alzheimer's, it progresses in stages.
Right.
And the person's needs and the demands on the caregiver, they shift as the disease progresses.
Yeah. So you're constantly, almost having to navigate a changing landscape, adapting to new and unpredictable terrain.
That's a really good way to put it. And I think that's where it becomes so important that caregivers have the information, the support, the resources to really help them through this.
Absolutely. And the guide does offer, some practical tips for some of those common challenges.
Okay.
For example, communication.
Yeah.
Like as people start having more and more difficulty communicating,
Right.
it suggests, speaking clearly and calmly, using simple sentences, relying more on nonverbal cues,
Right.
Gestures, facial expressions, things like
I think
that.
that's a good foundation. But I think it goes deeper than that too.
Yeah, for sure.
The communication, it's not just about the words, it's about that connection.
Yeah.
Empathy, understanding, like finding ways to still have that sense of shared understanding even as the disease progresses.
Right. It's about meeting them where they are,
Yeah.
cognitively and emotionally.
Absolutely.
And that takes a lot of patience, a lot of creativity.
Mhm. And I think sometimes it also means taking a step back and recognizing that, sometimes what might look like a behavioral problem is actually communication.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah.
So you're saying we have to kind of learn how to decode their behavior,
Exactly.
understand what the underlying need is.
It's like learning a new language.
Oh, wow.
One that's expressed, through actions rather than words.
Yeah, I like that. And speaking of behavior, the guide also talks about some of the more challenging behaviors,
All right.
things like agitation, aggression, even wandering.
Mm-hmm.
And it stresses, understanding the triggers,
Yeah.
creating a safe and supportive environment. And I think this is where understanding the different stages of Alzheimer's is really, really important.
Mhm.
Because the types of behaviors you might see early on,
Yeah.
like maybe mild forgetfulness or difficulty finding words,
Right.
those are very different from what you might see in the later stages,
Exactly.
where you might be dealing with, paranoia or hallucinations or even physical aggression.
It's almost like every stage has its own kind of hurdles,
Yeah.
and the caregivers have to really adapt their approach.
Yeah. And that's where that education and support is so critical,
Yeah.
for caregivers, because they need to be equipped to handle whatever comes their way.
Yeah. I mean, how do you think this all affects caregivers emotionally?
I mean, it has to be incredibly draining.
Oh, yeah, it is. I mean, the guide talks about caregiver burnout,
Right.
compassion fatigue, the risk of depression, anxiety. For those caring for loved ones with Alzheimer's, it's like a hidden epidemic.
Right. And so we have to be focused on supporting the caregivers just as much as we're focused on caring for the people with the disease.
Absolutely. And reminding those caregivers that, it's okay to ask for help.
Yeah.
Set boundaries, prioritize your own well-being. You can't pour from an empty cup.
Right. And that's something that the guide really emphasizes. That's self-care for caregivers.
It is.
And it talks about things like support groups, counseling, just finding ways to manage stress, maintain those social connections.
Because it can be incredibly isolating.
Yeah.
And emotionally draining. So, it's not weakness to admit that you need help. It's actually a sign of strength and self-awareness.
And it reminds us that we all have a role to play in supporting those who are affected by this.
Exactly.
Whether it's, offering a listening ear, providing respite care,
Yeah.
just advocating for better resources and support systems.
It takes a village. It really does.
It really does. And that village needs to be informed and compassionate and ready to step up
Yeah.
when they're needed, which is, I think, a perfect segue into part 2,
Okay.
where we're going to dive a little deeper into some of the more practical aspects of caregiving,
Sounds good.
some of the specific challenges,
Okay.
and some of the strategies that are out there. So stick with us. We'll be right back.
Yeah. It's really striking how the caregiver guide kind of balances those practical tips with a lot of empathy, like really acknowledging what families are going through.
It does. And it dives into some pretty, sensitive topics, too, things that often get glossed over.
Yeah.
I'm thinking specifically about the section on intimacy and sexuality.
Oh, yeah. That's huge.
Because, that's an area where Alzheimer's can have a really profound impact, both for the person with the disease
Right.
and their partner.
And I mean, you're dealing with changes in, cognitive function, emotional regulation, even physical abilities. Like there's so much there that can lead to a lot of confusion and frustration.
Yeah. And the guide really emphasizes, intimacy doesn't just disappear with an Alzheimer's diagnosis.
Right.
It might take on different forms.
Yeah,
But that need for closeness, for connection, it's still there.
absolutely. And I think it's about adapting to those changes, finding new ways to express love and affection,
Yeah. And it might be, simple things, holding hands, cuddling.
sharing memories.
Yeah. The guide even talks about, looking through old photos,
Yeah.
listening to music together. Those are great.
As ways to kind of rekindle those feelings.
Yeah, even if the person with Alzheimer's doesn't remember the specifics,
Mhm.
it's about those emotional connections that go deeper.
It's true. And, it's important for the partner to remember that their own needs are valid too.
Absolutely.
This is a lot to deal with emotionally.
It is. And it can be helpful to, to seek support. Talk to a therapist,
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
counselor, a support group. Give yourself permission to grieve what you've lost, but also to try to find ways to nurture that connection, even if it's different.
Right. The guide also kind of tackles another topic related to intimacy that I thought was really interesting, and that's hypersexuality.
Yeah.
And this is where, you start to see those complexities of Alzheimer's really come into play.
Because as the disease progresses, sometimes it affects the parts of the brain that control, impulses and inhibitions.
So it explains that some of the, the behaviors that might seem out of character, like inappropriate touching or comments.
Right. Those aren't necessarily intentional or malicious.
Right. It's not that the person is, suddenly promiscuous. It's the disease affecting their behavior.
Yeah. And so the guide recommends, redirecting their attention.
Yeah.
Providing reassurance.
Just creating a calm and structured environment.
Yeah. And if that doesn't work, talking to a doctor about, maybe medication options.
Right.
Or therapy.
To try to address those underlying issues.
Okay. So then another challenge that often comes up, especially in those later stages, is sleep disturbances.
Yeah, the guide talks about that.
Yeah. And there's this thing called sundowning, where the agitation and confusion kind of increase as the day goes on.
Yeah, and that's a really interesting phenomenon. It's thought to be related to the brain's internal clock, but also things like fatigue, overstimulation,
Right.
even changes in lighting.
So they recommend, establishing a regular sleep-wake cycle.
Yeah.
Getting plenty of natural light during the day.
Right.
A calm bedtime routine.
Those are all good things. And it's not just about the sleep, right?
Yeah.
It's really about the changes in mood and behavior that can be really difficult for everybody
Yeah.
to cope with.
The guide also mentions the potential for hallucinations, delusions, paranoia.
It's tough to even think about. Like imagine someone you love experiencing that.
Yeah. And I mean, instead of arguing or trying to convince them that what they're seeing isn't real, the guy says, validate their feelings,
Yeah.
reassure them, create a sense of safety.
Enter their reality,
Yeah.
even if it's different from ours.
And knowing when to, seek help from a professional, because sometimes medication can actually help manage those symptoms.
For sure.
So, despite all of these challenges, both the guide and the Alzheimer's Association report really emphasize focusing on what people with Alzheimer's can still do.
Yeah, that's important.
Rather than dwelling on what's been lost.
It's about preserving their dignity, their sense of self, their ability to still experience joy, connection.
Absolutely. And so, the guide suggests adapting hobbies, interests, finding new activities that provide that stimulation.
Yeah.
Even just simple tasks or chores that give them a sense of purpose.
Like if someone loved gardening, maybe you create a raised bed.
Right.
That's easier to access. Or if they enjoy cooking, find a simple recipe that they can help with. It's about those little sparks of joy and accomplishment.
And also maintaining those social connections, right? Because Alzheimer's can be so isolating.
It is.
So visits from friends and family,
Yeah.
support groups, even just walks in the park.
Yeah.
This can make such a difference.
Yeah. Even those brief interactions can provide a sense of belonging and purpose. And for the caregiver,
Right.
it's a chance to connect with other people who get it.
Yeah. Speaking of those social interactions, the guide actually offers some helpful advice for visitors.
Oh, yeah, I remember that. Like an Alzheimer's etiquette kind of thing.
It's like, a crash course.
It's great.
And it's full of, practical advice, like speaking clearly and calmly, avoiding confrontational language,
Right.
focusing on positive memories, shared experiences.
It's a good reminder that even though the person might have trouble remembering things, they can still feel kindness, respect.
That connection, yeah.
It's about treating them as individuals, not, just a diagnosis.
Right. So speaking of difficult decisions, the guide also talks about, transitioning to long-term care,
Oh, yeah, that's a tough one.
which, that's that point where providing care at home might just become, unsustainable.
Yeah.
Or even unsafe.
And families have to start exploring other options.
It's hard.
Yeah, it's filled with guilt, anxiety.
Loss.
Yeah.
And I think it's important to remember sometimes the most loving thing you can do is to, admit your own limitations and realize that, maybe you can't provide the level of care that they need at home.
Right. And the guide does a good job of walking people through those different types of facilities.
It does.
Assisted living, group homes, nursing homes, specialized Alzheimer's units.
Right. And it encourages families to really think about, what would best meet their loved one's needs, the level of care, the environment, the cost.
Yeah, it even offers tips for choosing a facility. Like, visit at different times of day, talk to staff, talk to residents, ask about care plans, activities.
Yeah, and stress the importance of still advocating for your loved one.
Yeah.
Once they've transitioned, it's not about abandoning them. It's about making sure they're getting the best possible care
Right.
in an environment that's, safe and supportive. And finally, the guide also doesn't shy away from the financial realities
Yeah.
of long-term care.
Which are huge.
It is. It provides links to resources, long-term care insurance, government programs. So it's about planning ahead and being realistic
Absolutely.
about the cost so you can make informed decisions.
And protect everyone's well-being, both financially and emotionally.
Right. Well, wow. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive
We have.
into Alzheimer's disease. It's been both enlightening and challenging
It has.
emotionally. What's really stuck with me, I think, is just the incredible resilience
Yeah.
of both the people living with the disease and the people caring for them.
It really speaks to the power of love, of compassion, and the strength of the human spirit
Yeah.
to keep going, even when it's really, really hard.
Absolutely. So I guess as we move into the last part of our deep dive, take a moment, kind of reflect on what's resonated with you.
Yeah.
Is it, the science behind it? Is it the personal stories? Is it the call to action?
Yeah. And as we kind of zoom out, look at the bigger picture, what are we taking away from this?
It's really amazing to me how even with such a daunting diagnosis, there are still those like glimmers of hope,
Yeah. Yeah.
moments of grace.
It makes you think about like how important it is to find meaning and purpose, even when things are hard. And that's where the Alzheimer's Association report really it zooms out,
Yeah.
looks at the big picture.
And it's not just about, managing those symptoms or providing care. It's about advocating for change,
Yeah.
pushing for a future where Alzheimer's isn't, a death sentence.
Right. And the report really, really emphasizes the need for more research. Like we need to understand this disease. We need to develop treatments that actually work and ultimately, find a cure.
Yeah. It's like we're in a race against time with millions of lives at stake.
It really is. And it's not just a scientific challenge, it's a societal one, right? Like we need to mobilize resources, raise awareness, create a culture of support.
And I think a big part of that is breaking down the stigma.
Oh, absolutely.
Because people with Alzheimer's and their families, they often feel so isolated, so ashamed, like they have to hide their struggles.
Yeah.
And we need to create an environment where people feel comfortable.
Seeking help, sharing their experiences.
Absolutely. The report also talks about the need for better policies,
Yeah.
to support caregivers,
Mhm.
improve access to quality care,
Right.
address the economic burden.
I mean, imagine a world where caregivers have access to paid leave, respite care, affordable home care services, where communities are set up to provide that support.
That's the vision
Yeah.
that we need to be working towards.
And it requires all of us to collaborate, to innovate, and to really prioritize the needs of those affected by Alzheimer's.
The vision we can achieve if we work together.
I think so.
Well, on that note of hope and collective action, it's time to wrap up this deep dive into the world of Alzheimer's disease.
It has been quite a journey.
It has, filled with some really hard truths,
Yeah,
but also a lot of inspiring insights.
I agree.
So I encourage everyone listening, delve a little deeper into these sources.
Yeah, they're really great.
The Alzheimer's Disease Data Initiative,
Mhm.
the Alzheimer's Association report. That caregiver guide is fantastic.
So-
And just remember, knowledge is power.
Yep.
The more we understand, the better equipped we are to support those affected, advocate for change, and hopefully one day find a cure.
I think so too. So until then, let's keep learning, keep caring, keep fighting for that brighter future.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on the